The welcome that I've seen American and British forces get in parts of Iraq is something I want to mention first, because there are people who say that that never happened. It's commonly said by political philosophers like Maureen Dowd, say, that where were the sweets and where were the flowers? Well, I saw it happen with my own eyes, and no one's going to tell me that I didn't. I saw it months after the invasion, people still lining the roads, especially in the south.
In the south?
Especially in the south. Right. Still lining the roads and waving, and the children waving, which is always the sign, because if the parents don't want them to, they don't.
Right.
For miles, it was like it was the nearest I'll get to taking part in the liberation of a country, to arriving with a liberating army. I'll never forget, and I will not allow it not to be said that that did not happen. And in the marshes too, the marsh Arab area of the country, which was drained and burned out poisoned by Saddam Hussein. Again, almost hysterical welcome. And in Kurdistan.
Since the eviction of Saddam Hussein from Kuwait, there has been a very careful, scrupulous, ruthless, hard-fought debate, which all of you, if you don't know about, should have educated yourselves about. Not conducted just in Washington, but in learned journals and on the internet and in public forums, going on for about 12 years. So the debate was this: were we right to confirm and leave Saddam Hussein in power after his eviction from Kuwait, re-establish him in effect in power, watch with our own military superiority as we gave his own helicopter gunships permission to re-establish control, a genocidal, fascistic control over the Iraqi people? Was that the right decision or not? And because it entails this too, was it right to put the Iraqi people under 12 years of suffering and misery and damage of sanctions, while the Saddam Hussein regime was able to build one palace in every single province remaining, the other 18 provinces of Iraq, dedicated to the wealth of a psychopathic and sadistic crime family? Was that the right decision or not? Many of us came soberly, but firmly, to the conclusion that that had been wrongly decided. Saddam Hussein should have been removed from power in Iraq in 1992.
And it's often, I think, very, very, very hard for people who live in civilized countries, democratic countries, to understand what it would be like to live even a day under a regime that was like this. I used to find in arguments about Iraq that I knew right away when someone didn't know what they were talking about. And the dead giveaway would always be when they would say, all right, I agree, Saddam Hussein is a bad guy. I said, that means you don't know. You don't know anything. They don't know. They don't know what fascism feels like. They don't know what it's like to see families forced at gunpoint to applaud the torture and execution in public of their family members. Saddam Hussein called a cabinet meeting where he ordered one half of his cabinet to shoot the other half, so that they could all be complicit, the survivors, those who hadn't been tortured to death or otherwise murdered. But remember, you said the population hated Saddam Hussein. That's true, really true. But more than anything, they feared him. They were terrified of him. These are people who were not just forced to obey under terrible and believable threat, but made to applaud, made to participate, made to come out and vote, made to come out and demonstrate that they loved him, made to applaud when their relatives were executed. You know, if your kids were going to be shot, you had to attend and you had to applaud. Okay, a pornographic regime, in other words. It's a mafia system as well as a national socialist and fascistic one. Saddam Hussein has destroyed the lives and society and environment of three populations in his country: the Kurdish, the Shia and the Marsh Arabs. What UNESCO calls the greatest crime against the human ecology ever committed, the destruction of the marshes of southern Iraq, the oldest wetlands in the Middle East, the smoke and destruction of which could be seen from the space shuttle. So terrible was the environmental decay. They don't know what it's like to see 180,000 members of the Kurdish people, at a minimum, killed by poison gas in the northern provinces of Iraq. They don't know what it's like to see at least that number of Shia Arabs killed in southern Iraq. This is evil, by the way. There isn't another word for it. President Bush didn't refer to an axis of sin. Don't get me wrong. Evil is a word not from religion, it's a word from modern political philosophy. It's from, in our usage, it's from Hannah Arendt. Radical evil and the banality of evil come from serious discussions about why it is that Europe became genocidal. People who titter at this, or the use of necessary words are frivolous and flippant. I can't tell you how through I am with people who talk like that. I can't tell you how through I am with them, how little respect I have for them, how sick I am of their little jingles, their avoidances of reality and responsibility.
An impression, I think, ladies and gentlemen, has been allowed to form and perhaps even to coagulate and to congeal that it is only those of us who support the regime change, the revolutionary change in Iraq, who have any explaining to do. I think that that assumption needs to be countered from the very beginning. If you examine the record of the so-called anti-war movement in this country and imagine what would have happened had its counsel been listened to over the last 15 and more years, you would have a world in which the following would be the case. Saddam Hussein would be the owner and occupier of Kuwait. He would have succeeded in the annexation, not merely the invasion, but the abolition of an Arab and Muslim state that was a member of the Arab League and of the United Nations. That's one consequence of anti-war politics. That's what would have happened. In the meanwhile, Slobodan Milosevic would have made Bosnia part of a greater Serbia, and Kosovo would have been ethnically cleansed and also annexed. The Taliban would be still in power in Afghanistan if the anti-war movement had been listened to, and Al-Qaeda would still be their guests. And Saddam Hussein, with his crime family, would still be privately holding ownership over a terrorized people in a state that's been most aptly described as a concentration camp above ground and a mass grave underneath it. Now, if I had that record politically, I would be extremely modest. I wouldn't be demanding explanations from those of us who said it's about time that we stop this continual capitulation to dictatorship, to racism, to aggression and to totalitarian ideology, that we will not allow to be repeated in Iraq, the failures in Rwanda and in Bosnia and in Afghanistan and elsewhere. And we take pride in having taken that position, and we take pride in our Iraqi and Kurdish friends who are conducting this struggle. On our behalves, I should say.
The decision to reverse American policy and to decide to be the emancipator of the Iraqi people, to help them write a constitution, to protect them from fascist attacks while they had a democratic election, to attempt to federalize the differences between them, which can otherwise only be solved by civil war or partition or dictatorship. This is a very honorable thing the United States has done and is doing with its allies. And it's a nice change to be doing that, to liberate the people and lock up the dictator. Obviously, some of you preferred it the other way around, or were happier when it was that way, or think Saddam Hussein was framed up, perhaps. I love it when people say that a serial criminal has somehow been unjustly accused. Well, we'll get to that, I've no doubt. Because apart from anything else, it's invariably a good thing to see Caligula on trial in front of his own people, with Milosevic, with Charles Taylor of Liberia, the invader and attempted genocide in Sierra Leone, where we prevented another Rwanda from taking place. Tony Blair getting, I think, particular credit for that in West Africa. And with the humiliation, I would happily call it, of Saddam Hussein in front of the people who he tortured and murdered and ruined for so long, and others too. No, one can't wish that undone, of course. We have brought one of the great war criminals of the world to justice and put him and his crime family and his main complicit associates on trial in public in a country where, until recently, very recently, it was death, slow death, very slow death, to possess a cell phone or a satellite dish. Despite the ridicule, despite the incompetence, despite the failures, despite the disappointments, let us review what we've done. First, we have removed a keystone state of the Middle East from the control and sole ownership of a psychopathic crime family who owned all of Iraq and treated its people as if they were disposable citizens. I remind you that this keystone state occupies a choke point on the Gulf and an arterial carotid point in the world economy. It cannot be left to the control of a fascistic mafia. I remind you further that it exists between the exorbitant Sunni Wahhabi theocracy of Saudi Arabia and the no less exorbitant Shia theocracy of Iran. To say, if we can recuperate Iraq, if we can recuperate its oil industry, if we can stop it being the private property of a psychopathic crime family, we can not only help the Iraqis,
but we can undercut the monopoly or the duopoly of Shia Iran and Wahhabi Saudi Arabia. Does anyone think this is a matter of indifference?
The problem with Iraq up till now has been that it's almost been innately dictatorial, its system, and thus aggressive and expansionist as well, because the Sunni minority, of which Saddam was the clan leader of a minority of that minority, the Tikrit mafia, doesn't have any oil under the provinces where it lives. Therefore, it has to govern the Shia and Kurdish majority by force in order to have access to the oil. Now, since the liberation of Iraq, quite a lot of new prospecting for oil has been done. And for example, in Anbar province, huge Sunni province between Baghdad and Jordan, very big deposits of oil have been found. We will be able, as well as having done what we've done, offering Iraq a federal constitution and having held 2 elections, to point out to people that the material basis, the actual economic basis for a federalism now exists. There could be an oil splitting, an oil sharing law. In fact, we're within measurable distance of getting one of those through the Iraqi parliament. I think that's a tremendous achievement, both in stabilizing and civilizing the region and in making sure that those resources are not controlled by criminals and fascists.
The liberation of Iraq, in other words, the decision that we had to move the Iraqi people and the region into a post-Saddam era, will stand, I'm convinced, as one of the greatest decisions of American statecraft, as one of the things that American soldiers, male and female, and politicians who voted for it, those who've defended it, will be proudest of in the future of any decision we've ever made.